Welcome to Virtual Sentiments. I'm your host, Kristen Collins. On today's episode, I talk to Osita Nwanevu. Osita is a contributing editor at The New Republic, a columnist at The Guardian, and a Democratic Institutions Fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. He is a former staff writer at The New Republic, The New Yorker, and Slate, and his work has also appeared in The New York Times, The New York Review of Books, The Nation, Harper's Magazine, The Columbia Journalism Review, In These Times, Flaming Hydra, and Gawker. His first book, The Right of the People, Democracy and the Case for a New American Founding, was recently published by Random House. We recorded this episode on July 6th, which is a perfect date, because this year is the 250th anniversary of the American founding. And this episode is one of three that we've devoted to the American political experiment. Each episode takes a different approach to commemorating the founding, emphasizing America's past, its present, or its future. Our first of this little series within our series was with Laura Field, released on July 3rd, which focused on America's present, how some figures on the new MAGA right interpret the founding, and the role those interpretations play in their critiques of liberalism today. This episode with Osita explores his vision for America's democratic future, arguments he develops through rigorous engagement with contemporary political science, history, and the works of the Founding Fathers. We discuss the Founding Fathers' intellectual arguments, but also the actual political compromises that they made on the long road that they traveled from revolution to the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution itself. Rather than treat the founders as having the final say on our politics and simply appealing to their authority, Osita draws on their spirit of change, of breaking with tradition, citing Thomas Jefferson's own concerns in a 1789 letter to Madison that a country's constitution should change with successive generations. As Osita says later in the episode, we have more of a capacity to shape this country than ghosts do. I hope you find our conversation as thought-provoking as I did. On today's episode of Virtual Sentiments, I'm talking to Osita Nwanevu. Osita is a contributing editor at The New Republic, a columnist at The Guardian, and the Democratic Institutions Fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. He is a former staff writer at The New Republic, The New Yorker, and Slate, and his work has also appeared in The New York Times, The New York Review of Books, The Nation, Harper's Magazine, The Columbia Journalism Review, In These Times, Flaming Hydra, and Gawker. His first book, The Right of the People, Democracy and the Case for a New American Founding, was recently published by Random House. Thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today, Osita.
Thanks so much for having me.
I am so excited because we are recording this, my understanding, towards the end of your book tour. So hopefully you're not too sick of talking about all this. But also it's July. We're at the end of the major celebrations downtown for America's semi-quincentennial. But we're still kind of very much in that year, right? And I do feel like your book is such a perfect thing to be reading right now and to be thinking about because you're reflecting on the past of American politics and of the founding of the Republic, of the Declaration of Independence. You have a recent piece on that as well that we can talk about too. But you're also kind of doing that in order to take stock of the present. And what really I loved about this book is that you were willing to be super ambitious about your claims that America is not a democracy and that it should be one. And you take really great care to explain what that means to you, what we should think of democracy, engaging with really cutting-edge, important, and relevant political science research, which, you know, I will say, not to be too negative, but a lot of times when you read pop science or more journalistic accounts of American politics, it can be frustrating as a political theorist, as a political scientist, because you feel like that literature isn't being engaged with. And you did so deftly. I mean, it was excellent. But then in doing that, you're engaging with this theory, giving us a sense of what American democracy should look like, and then also leveraging such an in-depth understanding of like American history, but also the policy landscape right now, and giving us like this really concrete vision of the reforms and the political actions we'd have to take in both, you know, the public institutions and the private sphere to actually make America a democracy, which is really cool. So I promise I'm not just buttering you up, but I wanted
just buy the book. That's the pitch you guys need. Right.
Yeah. But I wanted to frame, why I'm so excited to be talking to you and how I wanted to start this off. So I thought maybe you could start us off by reflecting a little bit on two things, which is like the motivation of the book. Why did you decide to write this book? And knowing that it takes time to write this, what do you think about the fact that it's, you've released it, you're going on a book tour coinciding with this anniversary of the American founding? I mean, what does that mean to you? What has that inspired for the book? And has it maybe changed the way you look at the book, or has it kind of just sort of fleshed out and help you show the impact of what you're trying to do to your audiences?
Yeah, sure. So it's funny you mentioned the commemorations, because I was actually out there in D.C. on the 4th of July. It was like 102 degrees, so there was some kind of sickness in me that pulled me there, despite the fact that it was a terrible time to be out and about.
Or American patriotism,
I guess so.
Osita, which might be one and the same thing.
But, I was there partially because I wanted to write something for one of those newsletters you mentioned, Framing Hydra, but I think it would have been there anyway. And I actually went to the National Archives for the first time. I'd grown up in the D.C. area, been to a lot of the museums in the D.C. area, but I'd never been to the archives, never seen a Constitution. And I figured, well, hell, today's the day to do it. So I was out there for a couple of hours in line, 102 degrees with all these sweaty but determined people. And then you finally get to this space, and it's this really huge kind of rotunda where they've got the Constitution, they've got the Declaration, they've got documents like the 19th Amendment. But you get in there, and there's just sort of this mob or gaggle of people in front of the Constitution, which is the central document in the space. And you can't see it. It's very hard to get close. There are people who are huddling over it. They were taking selfies, taking pictures of their kids. Nobody can actually see the document, I'm sure, in these pictures. You're just getting pictures of other people taking pictures. And so it was this remarkable moment where I got to see kind of in person one of the reasons why I wrote the book, which was to kind of demystify and bring that document in particular down to earth. I think the Constitution is an extraordinarily important document in the history of Republican governance. I think it's an important document in the history of political theory. I think it did a lot to make this country possible, and that's not something to take lightly. But I do think it has these fundamental problems that are really, really bedeviling our politics and have for some time. And as I was writing, I started about 10 years ago writing about politics in the middle of the 2016 campaign. Over the course of my still young career, it just occurred to me over and over and over again that we were facing problems that were products of the Constitution and sort of products of a kind of misunderstanding or kind of misapplication or a kind of shallow understanding of what democracy actually means. And so you can think about the 2016 elections being part of this. Donald Trump wins an Electoral College victory. Yeah. While losing the popular vote. But even beyond that, as I was covering the 2020 Democratic primary and all the policy issues people were talking about then, whether it was Medicare for all or immigration reform or gun control, climate change policy, Green New Deal, that kind of stuff, I found myself having to say over and over and over again, well, yes, this might be a good policy idea for this or that reason. It might have the support of this or that plurality or majority of the American public. But it's very, very unlikely that it's going to pass Congress, even if Democrats win the presidency, even if they win Congress. Given certain structural features of our federal system. And I found myself having to describe that situation over and over again without having the opportunity to really explain it or think through why that was. Why do we have a federal system that is structured the way that it's structured? Is it right to call it a democracy, given those kinds of challenges? When Republicans say, well, we're a republic and not a democracy, and that justifies the way the system's set up. Is that true? And is democracy even desirable? Can we sort of, in this moment where we're dealing with misinformation and the public not being informed about certain things, and all of these anxieties we have about the voting populace, polarization, should we even feel as gung-ho about democracy as we often do without taking a step back to question those things? So that's kind of where the book came from. I wanted the space and the time to leave the news cycle a little bit, consult political theory, consult a lot of books that have been sort of lying dusty on my shelf since college, and get to the bottom of what democracy actually is and use that as a entry point for really evaluating the political system without a kind of rose-tinted perspective.
Yeah. No, I mean, and I think that comes through in the work. And I also think I will also say, I mean, I think there's something that political theorists, the experts in academia can't do that you can do with the incredible experience you have writing about politics and being immersed in political discourse. And there is this strange thing, though, where distinguishing between like punditry and, ideas and theory, and then actually thinking, though, a big picture politics. Because you see, I think, similar, I won't name names, but similar people who have, huge audiences who made a name for themselves as being very knowledgeable about the literature, who then kind of treat everything as like a horse race politics and kind of give they're almost more like acting like political consultants in their punditry, as opposed to kind of helping us clarify and understand where we're at right now in this political moment and what direction we're going in and how to pull us into a direction that will be more consistent with the ideas and the values that we claim to care about, like democracy, like equality, like liberty. So let's get in a little bit more to the substance of the work then. And so thinking about kind of the way you start off the book, you do start with kind of a reading about the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. And so I want to dig in a little bit more, as we're commemorating this year, kind of the way that you approach this moment of commemoration. And instead of kind of looking at it through the rose-colored glasses like you describe. And so what does the Declaration of Independence kind of mean for you in this moment in terms of like what should we be thinking about when we look back on that? And specifically, what does it mean to think of it less in terms of this? You put it at the end of your recent article on the Declaration of Independence that, thinking of these founders as one generation of founders and thinking of the document not as mere artifact, but as example. So what does that mean and how does that play out in the book too?
Yeah, so as you say, I did write this essay for the New Republic on the Declaration for their 250 issue. And part of it's a history of the Declaration and its drafting, but also part of it is looking at how those words have been used, appealed to by different groups across American history up and through the president. And I think one of the things you sort of realize as you work through that history is, it's kind of like a death of the author perspective. Like people have used this document at different ends, but the animating ideal is, here is a set of words that contains a set of political principles that are alive to all people at all times. Like it makes certain claims about what human life is about, what it's for, how government exists to honor those things, protect those things, and what you're entitled to do when your governments don't do that very well. That is what justified a political revolution back in 1776. And I think it's an odd attitude to sort of look at that historical event and come away with a sense that actually our institutions are just there to be revered and deferred to. Yeah. That is not what the founders did. That is not how this country was founded. If you read the words of somebody like Thomas Jefferson in particular on constitutions, he famously wrote that he didn't believe constitutions could justly last, I think, more than 19 years. Yeah. And anything further than that was the dead hand of one past generation oppressing all future generations. I think 19 years is a little short by my estimation. But, I think that there's probably some reasonable medium between 19 years and more than 2 centuries when it comes to thinking about our founding documents and institutions. And that's kind of the thing I'm trying to say, I think, in that essay and also in this book. I don't think that we have to revere the founders as saints. I think we should take them seriously as political actors and political theorists. If we think that there's something to respect about the revolution, certainly it is in, the way of thinking that's encapsulated in the Declaration. Yeah. We are supposed to think deeply about whether our institutions match our principles and match our first premises about what human life is for and about. And we should be willing to challenge those institutions when it seems like they're falling short. That is, another thing I think the book exists to do, to give people the permission to believe that and believe about themselves. As you say, I think that the founders were only our first generation of founders. And there have been many, many people in the time since who've fundamentally reworked this country and its institutions to our collective benefit, whether that's, the radical Republicans, around Reconstruction, or the people who fought for women's suffrage, civil rights movement. There are all kinds of figures we could look to who've really reshaped this country in fundamental ways since it was founded. And to sort of only hold up and revere the founders in 76 and 87 and their creations as, definition of what this country is, and to sort of give those documents a kind of patina where it's like, they were taken down some mountain in Like stone tablets.
Yeah.
It's not. I think that's a weird attitude to have, especially given again that we are, by my lights, falling short in so many respects in our politics because there are these flaws to the Constitution in particular.
No, I think that's exactly right, and I think you do put it in your writing about this. It's an invitation to engage in political philosophy. I mean, how many countries can have that as a part of their founding myth? I mean, and I mean that myth not necessarily in a negative or false way. I just mean, like, of course, that moment has this incredible historical legacy for us. But when we kind of encase it within glass and kind of treat it as something more revelatory, then we forget the inherent participatory kind of deliberative aspect of what is happening in that moment. And that's, I'm putting that in a still relatively beautiful, idealized way. And what I wanted to also invite us to talk about, and this is what I just think a lot about, because right now we're in a political moment that seems very fraught. I mean, January 6th is still, I think anyone who's thinking about American democracy has to reckon with that blemish or that undermining of the tradition of a peaceful transfer of power, which is one of the major kind of basic institutional definitions of what a democracy means in a modern kind of political science sense when we kind of categorize these regime types. And so, we have all this tension, all this fear. People are worried. And yet, we've gone through arguably even worse moments in our past that we've had to go through. And the revolution being kind of this also inherently violent moment in terms of reckoning with it and creating this country out of the empire, right? The British Empire. And so in that moment, it's not this perfect revelatory and pure founding experience, but it is something that's also fraught with political compromises. And as you were saying, as you were indicating, I mean, these were compromises that were not peacefully negotiated over time. It institutionalized and formalized major forms of oppression and forms of inequality, and in order to achieve the establishment of the country. And I think there are people who are very, when you say that to them, they get so upset because it feels like a personal affront, and it means that you can't draw inspiration from this. But it's more like we have to hold these things at once, and also maybe there's a lesson about politics there for us in terms of understanding that. So I wondered if you have any thoughts on that in terms of the political compromises, the processes, also from like the Articles of the Confederation, that period of time, to the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution.
Well, I mean, I think that's the period of time where this is sort of most obvious when it comes to thinking about the founders. I mean, we had an initial constitution in the Articles. I think that this is one of the things that your basic American history education gets right. It was a terrible document. I mean, it took supermajorities to basically get anything done, or unanimity to get anything done. Made it basically impossible to have a national trade policy. Made it impossible to do a lot of things that you need to do to sort of get a fledgling country off the ground. And there was a process for amending the Articles. They needed unanimous agreement from all the different states. And as the founders convened in Philadelphia without, by the way, Rhode Island, for reasons I get into the book.
And I do want to hear those, but you can set that aside.
Yeah. So they know at the outset, look, we're not going to get unanimous agreement for anything that we do here. But we're in a situation that is bad enough by our lights. And we could talk about whether or not they were justified in thinking some of the things that they did. But they know, like, by our lights, we're not actually going to be able to resolve this crisis unless we come to a new document. And we're going to ignore the rules that exist for amending the Articles. We're going to ignore the mandate that we're sent to Philadelphia with, only to amend the Articles and come up with a different set of governing institutions for this country. Yet another radical move from a revolutionary generation. And again, to sort of understand the document that resulted, the Constitution, is something that we have to keep etched in stone and respect for all time. Is kind of strange given its origins there.
Yeah.
But if you read the notes from the convention, if you read the letters that the founders were sending back and forth between themselves as the Constitution was being drafted and then ratified, this is not a document that was produced purely as a function of political theory or high-minded ideals. There are a lot of practical compromises they had to make, a lot of things that Hamilton and Madison did not want in the final document that ended up in the final document that they had to defend.
Yeah.
And I think, again, it's important to sort of have that in mind so we don't think that this is something that was created without any mistakes or any possibility of improvement or even radical redesign. It is a political document for a particular time, made by people with particular economic and political concerns. We now have ours, and we should have the right, or feel that we have the right, to sort of think about fundamentally different arrangements on that basis. And, if 100 years hence, having done that, some other generation says, well, looking around us and, our colony on Mars or whatever, we think we might need a new constitution now. They may. I just think that process of regeneration is just how societies sensibly, rationally respond to their own circumstances. We have one of the oldest and hardest to amend constitutions on the planet. Average lifespan, I think there's a study at the University of Chicago, a few years ago, or maybe a decade ago, that found that the average lifespan of constitutions in the developed world is something like 32 years, I believe. We're very, very out of whack. And I think part of it has to do with this reverential attitude, or not feeling we have the permission. Even though we know more about governance, we have political science, we have the ability to evaluate political questions with more rigor than the founders did. Despite all of that, not to speak of our belief in equality and the fact that we believe that Black people and women and all kinds of minorities deserve rights, despite all of that, we still don't think that we are enough, or that we measure up enough to make our own decisions here. And I think that that's something that the book really tries to challenge.
Yes. No, and I think it does. And and there's so much now we can shift to talking about that more and moving more towards the present and how to make it democratic. But, because we have a little bit of the historical bent here. And you did get to bracket why wasn't Rhode Island included? Because I think that's such an important part of that history.
Yeah. So to do like a very, very condensed version, the United States leaves the revolution in a state of economic crisis, basically. A lot of property has been destroyed. A lot of people, farmers, people in the backcountry, are really struggling to pay their debts and to pay, new taxes. And there are movements up and down the country to address this situation, kind of early populist movements, by a variety of measures. Some of them are things like paying for your debts and taxes in kind with certain goods, other kinds of debtor relief. But I think the thing that really ends up influencing the founders the most is this desire to print paper money in order to put more money into circulation and make the discharging of debts and the payment of taxes easier. Rhode Island is one of the states that really, really takes to this. And the founders are horrified by the situation overall. They think that these measures, and the printing of paper money in particular, basically undermines the stability of contracts, indulges people who've been spending too much from the founders' perspective and not being fiscally responsible. They think it might lead to attacks on private property in general. And so one of the main reasons why the Constitution ends up being drafted is to sort of create a sovereign and active federal government that's capable of controlling the economic situation in the country without leaving it to state governments that are much more active and much more powerful functionally than the Congress under the Ideological Confederation. Rhode Island knows that this is what's up. And they refuse to send delegates to the convention on that basis. And that creates a dilemma because, again, the founders know, this is one of the provisions of the articles, you cannot really fundamentally amend the document without unanimous agreement from all the different states. And that is one of the things that I think forces them to the conclusion that they have to come up with some completely new arrangement. There's been a lot of, historiographic debate about this over the last century especially. People talk about the Beard thesis early in the 20th century. The Beard thesis, reductively was, well, the founders did all this because they personally were going to profit from the development of a new constitution. That has been overstated. It wasn't so much the personal finances that were at stake as much as this general principle of who gets to control the economy and also the principle of democracy. It is one of the things, this crisis, that convinces people. Washington says this in one of his letters, I believe. Maybe the British were right to doubt that mankind was fit for its own governance without superior authorities. Maybe this crisis shows us, and rebellions like Shays Rebellion, which is one of the things I think that people do learn about in school, there's a real cynicism and anxiety about the level of public power that arises after the revolution, and the Constitution is written to bring that under control.
Let's then respond head on to those who would say, if we complain today about how undemocratic our institutions are, who would say, well, America's not a democracy, it's a republic. So what's kind of you think like the best way to respond to that? Because we see, like you just said, there was anxiety about public power. And so to some degree, there was an attempt to kind of exclude this democratic energy, right? But, why should we not be satisfied with that? Why should we not just then defer to our fathers, let's say?
So I think we have to define our terms. And that's what the first couple of chapters in the book, well before I even get into the history, are about. In the first chapter, I define, certainly beyond any controversy or debate or disagreement, what democracy is for all time.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure that's a definition that nobody will have any trouble with ever again. But to me, democracy, talk about, the gap between Athenian democracy and representative democracy. And, why is it that we call both of these kinds of systems that are so different the same name? And what I say is, I think that in either case, what we're trying to achieve or bring about is governance by the governed public. In the democracy, the people are the ones who do the governing for themselves. Or in Lincoln's construction, government of, by, and for the people. There is no superior class of elites or, people with hereditary privilege who have the privilege of controlling society. The people who are themselves subject to governance are the ones that are doing the governing. Many, many different systems you could create to try to achieve that ideal, but that's what we're trying to achieve. And by my lights, the three main components of any democratic system that actually accomplishes that are political equality. Again, there's no class of people that has an entrenched privilege or a different set of rights. Responsiveness. Democracy is not a suggestion box, and people come together to act. Something does happen. Might not happen directly or immediately, but the system is obligated to respond in some way to the public coming together. And the third thing is majority rule. So of all the different ways we might make a collective choice together, from supermajority agreement all the way to some form of minority rule. Majority rule is the decision rule that respects the equality of all the participants. Those are the three components of democracy as I see it. And I, again, go through in the first chapter why I think that system is good. Now, I also offer in these early chapters a definition of republicanism. And this is something I derive mostly from the work of Philip Pettit and people in that kind of political theory school and republicanism, where they talk about republicanism as a system designed to prevent entrenched power that might dominate others. So if we think of liberalism as a political philosophy that's about, preventing active abuses, somebody in government or governments in general, not having, the right to or the ability to directly abuse you in some kind of way or take something from you. Republicanism is about, okay, how do we prevent institutions, governments, parties in society from acquiring that much power to begin with?
It's a possibility.
It's a possibility. How do we sort of prevent that possibility from happening? The government might not be abusing me today. I might be able to go to court if it does, or have some other recourse if it does. Republicanism is about, how do we sort of ensure that you're never in that situation to begin with? And there are many different institutions you can create to thwart the creation of power in that kind of way. You can talk about written constitutions, institutions that protect the rule of law, and so on and so forth. But those institutions and those systems are not intrinsically democratic in the terms that I described democracy. And we can look at history. Like we can think about the Roman Republic, for instance. Some democratic features, the tribune of the plebs and so on, but it was not a representative democracy in the way that we understand it now. We could talk about the Italian city-states of the Middle Ages and Renaissance, right? Widely understood as republican governance. They had very, very complex systems for distributing power. Most people in those societies could not participate in politics, so they weren't democracies. So there is a real difference there. And I think, at the end of the day, the people on the right mostly who say that we're a republic of some kind, certainly not a democracy, I think have the better side of the argument to me. And I think this is one of the most controversial things in the book, because if you're on the left like I am, you're supposed to reject that. No, like all they meant by republicanism, at the founding was representative democracy. I complicate that in the fourth chapter. It's a lot of like very deep textual whatever I can't really get into now. But there is a real difference there. You are talking about different systems. You can certainly have, and I think we should have, democratic republics that, take everything that is worthwhile and meaningful and good in Republican governance and sort of nonetheless respect majorities and respect the public's right to rule. That isn't what we have. We have a system of distributed power in this country that happens to empower minorities. people who happen to live in certain parts of the country, people of certain ideologies, and so on. And I think that that's what ought to change. Those inequities are the equities that motivate the book in the first place. So it's a very long-winded answer, but I do think that there are fundamental differences between Republican governance and democratic governance. You can have democratic republics, and that is what I'm urging us to move towards in this country.
No, I don't think that was long-winded at all. I mean, it's a big question, impressively condensed and clear answer for that. And it's something that I will say I struggle with, because when people ask me that, it's like, I guess for me, it's also at the end of the day, I might see the point and say, sure, at that moment, they didn't want a democracy and they didn't create one. But why should we defer to that? I mean, why should we be satisfied with that? I mean, both of us were very much excluded from the institutions they created at that moment. So, how could I possibly totally defer to it?
I think that this is like the is-ought problem, right? Like, I think that people believe that if you win the debate against the rights, let's say, on whether we were founded as a republic or a democracy, you fundamentally resolve the question of what America is and should be. And that is not the case. Like, it is, from my perspective, true. The republic that people at the founding intended to create a kind of republic that was not democratic by my lights and by, I think, most of our lights. That has no bearing to me on where we ought to go as a country and the kind of country we ought to be. But this perspective on history where if you sort of win an argument about the fundamental character of something that happened 200 years ago, you've settled for all time what America is I think, wrong-headed. I think we see it in all kinds of debates, not necessarily constitutional debates even, but just in our general kind of discourse about American history, where I think people want to say, often with great intentions and progressive intentions, well, we're freighted by this DNA. We're freighted by this kind of evil or this kind of action that happened. I think that we have the agency to look at that and take it seriously and think critically about the ways in which the past still influences the present, but also to say, well, we're here now. And, we have more of a capacity to shape this country than ghosts do, and we should continue to do so. That's I think the motivating impulse behind the republic versus democracy debate is this kind of attitude towards history, where it's just, I don't think that the stakes of that debate are whoever wins, they've decided what America, governing institutions ought to be like. I just don't have that attitude towards thinking through that question.
No, and I do think that, but also what I love about the book is that while, you are very ambitious in it and you're taking it to, you are, I think, challenging those who would just oversimplify how we commemorate and remember the founding. I also do, but there is this deep, also it's deeply historical what you're doing. And it's also, you still value and I wouldn't say you still have like I don't want to say reverence necessarily, but you still have a deep respect for this moment and for the history and for the text. And it's actually precisely because of that respect that you're able to understand it in it's all of its complexity and all of the disagreements and the dissent and all of the politics of that moment that I think is very valuable and very unique. And so, I do want to make sure we kind of underscore that as we say, why should we just be led by the dead hand that to use Thomas Jefferson's words. Yeah,
I think I say at some point in the fourth chapter, I take the arguments that, these were a group of, dozens of white men who owned slaves and there were no women and they, participated in the genocide of Native Americans. I take all of that seriously. If that were all that I had to say for my argument, it would be a much shorter book. So I thought that would be more interesting. Sort of, okay, all of that is true. And yet, if we take them at their word and we take the action of the revolution seriously, I think we're still left with a lot of reasons to have a different attitude towards these documents. And that's worth saying, partially because I think the people are used to the other arguments, which is not to deny its significance or its substance. But, I think, I'm interested in these people as political theorists. I'm interested in the revolution as, one of the most extraordinary things I think has ever happened in human history. I don't think that's wrong to believe or to say. Also, I don't think saying that dismisses all the complexity of the revolution. I just think it was an extraordinary thing. The Constitution was an extraordinary document. But there's still events and still documents that we have the right to sort of think critically about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I will say I think it's really important that we grapple with the contradictions of the moment in terms of these men writing this, writing the Declaration of Independence, but also creating the Constitution. All of this, so and there is also literature that critically engaged republicanism in terms of like its definition of liberty on the basis of the existence of slavery. I mean, both in terms of just intellectually defining freedom, in respect to the other, of the people who are enslaved in that system and of the existence of slavery. But then also it's the way in which, the freedom, the ability to kind of think deeply and spend all this time on political philosophy or on citizenship, on civic action, is dependent on the fact that you are free from labor because you have oppressed and you've enslaved others. And that, so we have to grapple with those things. You can't, ignore it. And I think, and that is true for the, early America, but it's also true for the ancient, heritage that they were drawing on intellectually in terms of Athens or in terms of Greece and in terms of Rome as well. And so, that's just also that has to be a part of the discourse. You can't neglect that.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think the book is ultimately a work of political economy.
Yes, great.
So we talked about that a little bit as far as the origins of the Constitution were concerned. But, as I worked through towards the end of the book, the features of the American system that I think ought to change, there's a chapter on political institutions.
Yes.
I talk about all the things you would expect, the Electoral College, the Senate, redistricting, money in politics, all of that kind of stuff. But the last chapter, perhaps more provocatively here at the Mercatus Center, is about economic democracy. Yeah. It's about, the extent to which our freedom, our liberty, and our agency, if we care about democracy, is shaped by our economic institutions and the power that we have or don't have as workers. And one of the reasons why I think it's worth considering ways we might empower ourselves as workers in the economy is precisely, one of the things you said, which is, your freedom and leisure time to think critically about the society you're in, your ability to participate in politics with any meaningful kind of power, it depends, I think, a little bit on the extent to which you live in an egalitarian society and the amount of economic resources you have available to you. So, this is something that I'm obviously thinking about a lot now when it comes to the tech industry and AI and its impacts and so on. But, if the book had been written, even a year after if I'd started it even a year later, there would have been so much more about AI in it. And it's to the benefit of the book that I was not obsessed in the way that I am now.
That's what I was going to say. I was about to say, thank goodness, because I don't think it would. I think it has a enduring kind of features of the arguments where you can, when you read it now, you can clearly think about AI.
Yeah.
But I also think that this is what really just, you've seen me like more emotional than I'm going to get here. But it does grind my gears the way that, AI has also, people have kind of treated it as this so fundamentally novel question and moment that we're in. And of course, there's a lot of novelty. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty. And yet, if you take a longer view, and if you also think about what we've been dealing with in America, it is dealing with the rise of automation before AI and the changes in all sorts of people's lives in terms of their work environment. And also a lot of those changes themselves, you can't just reduce it to technology. Yeah. It is shaped, as you said, by the economic institutions that are shaped by laws and policies. And so, I think no matter what people, like you said, that part of the argument, if you got very excited, you're like, oh, I'm gonna also I shouldn't read the book. I shouldn't look at the camera. If you got, if you're listening to this conversation, you got really excited, I can't wait to read the book, and you're somebody who's maybe a dyed-in-the-wool free market classical liberal, you should know maybe you're going to get a little riled up by the later chapter on economic democracy. But I think it's worth engaging with, especially for that, because I think we need to have these conversations. Because I also think in not having these conversations, we are making it, we're obscuring and we're kind of not providing answers to people who are going through truly disruptive experiences in their work lives and their personal lives over the past, again, not just from AI, but going back to the 90s, going back further than that.
Yeah.
And so, I do think that that's crucial. But I want to take these different parts of your argument in turn. But like you just said, it is very much a book of political economy. And so why don't we first focus on the public institution, on the political institutions? Because I think the other thing here is that there are a lot of people who, when they make the argument that America is a republic and not a democracy, they will rely on the fact that the founders and also just, and this is, I think, common. I don't think all of liberalism has to be motivated by this, but I think it's a common theme among liberals, especially, is that there is an anxiety of democracy and there is an anxiety of tyranny of the majority. And so that's the thing they want to avoid. For me, I'm always a little bit like, well, do you maybe think that you got to also avoid tyranny of the minority, right? I mean, that's also a historical problem and also, something that we don't want to have. And I don't want tyranny of anybody, right? But and so why don't you the thing that really stuck out to me was how much I could give that chapter to people who are interested in those debates in terms of understanding, well, here's why. Yes, I don't think that America is under a tyranny of majority. And in fact, we have to reckon with the way in which maybe the bigger threat is tyranny of minority, and not necessarily in a way that was designed by these, pretty undemocratic founders, but actually dynamics in institutions, things like the filibuster, that were not original to the Constitution. So, I know you won't be able to get into all of that, but maybe give us a little bit of an image of the argument you make there in terms of the nature of our political institutions, why they're not democratic, how we can make them more democratic.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I feel, a lot of people who listen to this probably are familiar with some of these arguments, but there is some comparative work on the Senate in particular where I point to research that's even to the extent that you might believe that having a bicameral legislature is desirable in certain ways and, the extent to which you might desire some kind of filter mechanism, I'm, very far left in this respect. But even if you're somebody who believes that, empirically, we have one of the most malapportioned upper houses in the entire world. I think only Argentina and Brazil, according to one study, has an upper house that's more inegalitarian than the Senate on a vote-to-vote basis. Yeah. So I think that matters. I think it matters. I think it distorts policy that somebody in Wyoming has about 60 times representation in that chamber as somebody in California does. I think that's unhealthy for policymaking.
Yeah.
And I think that there's some familiarity with some of the arguments there. But one of the things I think I try to say in the book, in that chapter on the Senate in particular, and the filibuster in particular, that maybe people aren't familiar with is, first of all, this is one of the areas where Hamilton and Madison were very disappointed.
Yeah.
Madison says at the convention that the Senate, as it's currently constructed, is a very stupid idea.
Yeah.
It would create all of these different minoritarian distortions. It would, upend stability in the country. It was just bad. And they were forced to the Senate's current design and what people know as a Connecticut Compromise because the small states basically threatened to walk out of the convention. Yeah. You have Gunning Bedford of Delaware getting up to make a speech to say, look, if we don't have equal representation in the Senate, we might secede from the United States and join some other foreign country. So they were really at a kind of impasse there that they had to do something about. And to Madison's disappointment, and it's disappointment you can actually read in the Federalist Papers, he's very, very half-hearted in describing the Senate and why it makes sense. To disappointment, that's the arrangement we are stuck with. Obviously we have the direct election of senators now, which we did not have before, and that matters. But it's a really, really crazy institution. And the filibuster, as you say, which was not part of the original design, only makes it crazier. We functionally have a non-functional Congress. It passes certain things, certain major laws do get passed, but it's very, very hard to pass legislation. You have to do all these workarounds through reconciliation, perhaps, that actually end up distorting the policy that you're trying to craft because you have to meet the requirements of the bird bath. And there are also these kinds of social and political impacts, too, that I don't think people think enough about. I mean, if you're concerned about polarization and you're wondering why we've gotten so polarized and what we might do to resolve that, I think it matters that many, many people are sending people to Congress knowing that Congress is not going to do a whole lot. Yeah. And if Congress is not going to do a whole lot as far as policymaking is concerned, and also your political opponents aren't going to do a whole lot if they win, the stakes to you of the vote you make in a primary are going to be very, very low. Why not elevate somebody who's like a talk show host or a political influencer that just makes you feel good if you know that you're not actually going to get a working Congress that's productive and that's constantly passing legislation? So all kinds of things like that and dynamics I think are really, really deranging our politics. And there are fixes. So, I'm not somebody who supports having an Article 5 convention tomorrow. Yeah. I see the idea of replacing the Constitution as a long-term movement that's going to take many decades and generations, and it's going to take, building more buy-in from the public on a lot of these ideas. But there are some things we can do very, very quickly, relatively speaking, that take only majorities in Congress. Or when it comes to the Electoral College, I talk about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. That's something that state legislatures can do, are on their way to doing, frankly. There are like 200 electoral votes committed to that process. So I talk about feasible solutions that are not pie-in-the-sky solutions that don't require constitutional amendments for the most part. And I hope that chapter reads practically to people, even people who are not, fire-breathing leftists like myself. I think on basic good governance grounds, we have a federal government that's not working very well, and a lot of that can be attributed to either the Constitution or, institutions that we've developed that are functionally parts of our small c Constitution at this point.
Well, and I think that that's really important because I think that the executive branch now just has, and whoever is in the White House has incredible power. And I mean, to some degree, that power is brittle. I mean, it's been always increasing. I mean, Trump has had, a huge increase in executive orders, but there's also been an uptick over time of executive orders. And also, the next president, when the first thing they come in is kind of undo all those executive orders. So those things are not, they're not there, but the power that it has is immense unpredictability and uncertainty, and the reason why that's happening is partly because of how powerless, how dysfunctional Congress is, and that really is the more representative institution, and that is like what I'm very frightened by. I will say is that increasingly it feels like people are forgetting. At least I thought that public discourse and kind of the understanding of American democracy was an understanding that Congress was really the most representative institution and is supposed to be kind of the main way that, popular power kind of functions. And we can see that at the federal level in terms of responsiveness to constituents. The president in power might not represent you in the sense that you voted for the other party, but you have this. But legislation is supposed to be taking place at the congressional level anyway. So you don't, there's a certain check in terms of how much that national election matters. And now it feels like that is the most important thing, and that which coincides with, Americans, partly the media environment, people identifying more with national identity and paying attention to national politics because of the decline of local media, all these, again, political economic conditions. But that's very frightening. I don't think so. When you worry about tyranny of the majority in congressional legislation, you've just now created the autocratic threat that we know they were worried about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is another one of the things where if the book had been written a little bit later, it would have been different in a substantive way. So I'm focused mostly on Congress in that chapter, but I do talk about the executive, and I would have talked about the executive more, especially given what we've seen in the last year. Yeah. The idea that, somebody donates $250 million to a campaign, they're given a special place in the subsequent administration where they get to unwind programs and dismantle departments and so on, and there's no congressional oversight. I mean, that's a remarkable situation. Look at this war with Iran we're in the middle of, right? I mean, one of the things the Constitution does say that I think makes sense is Congress has the power to declare war. Well, that's functionally no longer true. We have this kind of runaway executive, and I think partially because, to your point, Congress is now ineffectual. We have presidents coming in, understanding that their legislative pushes aren't actually going to go anywhere. And so they issue all these executive actions that get reversed in the next administration. The White House gets to take in a lot of power. There's a lot of trying to legislate either through the courts or through the agencies. Yes. All of that's more opaque and less transparent than it might be if you were actually having legislatures do their job and craft legislation in the public eye. So all of that really matters and is I think symptomatic of the ways in which the system is very unbalanced and dysfunctional right now. Yeah.
No, and that also points to the fact that there is this other kind of way, and we need to kind of take a holistic view of the American democratic experience and the threats that we face, because then let's get on the table a little bit, but again, I think we're going to zoom out so that it's more relevant no matter what is happening in the state of technology. But right now, there's all this discourse around AI regulation. In fact, I was somewhere and I was in London this last week, and people there were really kind of and I've heard this from other people too. There was this sort of even Trump seems to think we should regulate AI, and that gives them kind of some kind of hope. Yeah. And there's something very frightening, I will admit to, even though I'm somebody I'm not a priori or inherently against regulation by any means, but I'm very afraid of the fact that we are in this incredibly disruptive technologically and economically disruptive moment, and yet we have this incredibly dysfunctional government that is probably even easier for the best organized, well-funded companies, for example, to lobby, to influence that decision-making at that kind of central authority executive level. And so when I think about what regulation is most likely to, be successful, I don't have a lot of confidence it'll be in the support of Americans more broadly, of people I care about. I mean, how am I supposed to be optimistic about that?
I don't think there's much reason to be unless certain things change. I mean, I do. So as I said, I talk about money in politics a good bit in the 5th chapter. And one of the things I try to do is sort of complicate or frustrate this conception people have where it's like everything that's wrong in Congress is like this company shows up in an office with like a big bag of money they put on a desk and then they get the legislation they want. That happens sometimes. It's not usually the way that these things work. I think that the channels of influence are much more diffuse. There's this great paper, I think, from 20 years ago. I think it's called something like Why Isn't There More Money in Politics? Where they basically say, well, relative to the resources that corporations have, they actually underinvest in politics in a certain way. It takes very little. And so I try to think through, like, okay, how is this actually working based on research? And a lot of it is like, people come into Congress without a whole lot of technical knowledge, for the most part, on all the issues they might have to legislate on. They might know a lot about a given issue that's, relevant to their constituency and so on. When it comes to like technology and very, very technical fields, they often just don't know a whole lot about the thing they're supposed to be regulating or crafting legislation about. And so that creates an opportunity for, whether it's Anthropic or OpenAI or whatever, in this case, come to Congress and say, well, look, like we know about this issue. We're developing this technology, and we're here as like fair-minded, good, objective people. We're not here just to make money. We're here to inform you as to how this technology works and how it might be best regulated. We saw this parade over the last couple of years of them doing this. And because people don't have the resources, the knowledge, the background to interpret those kinds of claims and that information critically, in a lot of cases, companies end up getting what they want. And it might not be that money changed hands at all. So there are all kinds of ways in which that power manifests itself. It's not just through, well, I think we should reform campaign finance and formal lobbying. It's, they prop up a think tank that puts out a report on a given issue. And, some staffer picks it up and shows it to their member and they read it. And that's how they think about that issue, or that very, very granular policy issue. It might be, people are hanging out and doing golf with people of this set. Like, so money manifests itself in all kinds of ways. And, one of the arguments for the 6th chapter on political economy is, as much as we might hope to regulate the more direct forms of influence, campaign financing and lobbying, we still have an economy where if things are very, very unequal, all of those other channels get utilized nonetheless to shape policymaking, maybe in contravention of what the majority either wants or would benefit from. And that's worth taking seriously. And I think that AI, this is one of the things that makes me the most worried. I mean, hell, we have congressmen who still don't know what the internet is, let alone generative AI. And, going back to the dysfunction of the Senate and how Congress has struggled to pass legislation in general, we've seen over the last 20 years, bipartisan legislation on whether it's gun control, immigration, different issues get taken up and fail nonetheless. I say this as somebody, again, who's like a fire-breathing leftist, with no love for bipartisanship intrinsically. But if you're somebody who believes that we have to come together to pass laws and all that jazz, that we've seen that happen and get thwarted by the institutions in so many cases. And that's another, I think, hurdle to having some kind of reasonable arrangement get made on AI.
Well, I think what you're also pointing to there is that, and bringing us into that next chapter on economic democracy, but it is related to conversations I've had this season on the podcast with Sam Bagg, who has a book, Dispersion of Power, on thinking of democracy as like as a negative ideal, as kind of diffusing power and reducing the risk of state capture by any one large group, but that what that requires is a civil society, and this is what's interesting to me, is I think that there's a way in which liberals have often thought of civil society as this kind of nice, fuzzy, apolitical space. People are, the sort of Tocquevillian voluntaristic associations where people don't rely on the state. They don't, engage in the kind of political lobbying and the kind of political associations, and they're able to kind of solve their own problems together, neither through profit nor through that kind of political action. And of course, that is very true. But there's also a way in which civil society goes hand in hand with politics, hand in hand with democracy, because it shapes, it allows for people to create these organizational forms, these organizations, these collective group memberships that also kind of challenge power within that private sphere too. So Sam talks about, civil society organizations, which also include things like unions. And so again, unions might be somewhat controversial for some people, but what they do represent is this idea of people having a right to form organizations together. And that being a part of potentially challenging the way in which, management at companies, executives at companies have also the biggest say in terms of how they might be influencing, the way that these technologies are discussed and debated and how they're conceptualized. And even though, again, like you said, no money is changing hands. But that's also, it's kind of then just thinking about this idea of like the private sphere, civil society being a part of democratic life as well. And it itself kind of both creating and shaping democracy, but also being shaped by the political institutions that we have. And so I wanted to, so just as a general invitation to then moving us, campaign finance is a kind of good bridge to get us into the economic sphere and what it means to be thinking in terms of economic democracy and what does that look like?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I don't really say this much in the book itself, but I have been doing some background writing on liberalism here and there for the past couple of years. And I talk a lot about, in some of that writing, the freedom of association, right? So when it comes to politics, you can't really do anything by yourself.
Yeah.
You can write a letter to your congressman. You can do some things, you mouth off on social media, but any kind of actual political activity depends upon people working together in concert through civil society institutions, other organizations that are informal and so on. We do politics together. And we develop the capacities that we need to sustain democracy in particular together. Again, if you are concerned about polarization, if you're concerned about the tenor of our political debate, you're concerned about the extent to which people can read political information literately and so on, I think that a lot of that discourse is also pointed to the absence or the decline of civic institutions that help provide those skills to people. I think that unions can be understood as an important part of that civic infrastructure. Like setting aside the rest of the economic argument, if you want more places in American life where people come together with people who are different from them for a collective purpose, who get socialized into politics and political participation, who learn how to make arguments and rally people, like that's all work that unions help do and helped do when they were stronger in this country. And so I think that, they should be understood as organizations that contribute to that civic infrastructure. And I think that might, derange our politics less if people had the opportunity to develop those capacities. Even more controversially, I talk about ways that we can sort of institutionalize this within firms themselves when it comes to works councils and other kinds of labor organization internal to firms that you see more commonly in Europe. But part of the argument there is certainly that people need, and we collectively as a society need places where people learn how to do politics or to practice some of the basic capacities that we need to make democracy work. I just think that in a very real absence, we should be turning to unions, I think, for all kinds of reasons, but for that reason in particular, I think the argument makes sense.
Yeah, and I think there's a way in which, there might be some kind of liberal argument about, not necessarily enthusiastic, but at least accepting of unions as, sure, that should be one among many contractual, organizational forms that we can allow. But what are the ways in which, America is itself currently, the way our institutions are structured that shape unions, that is fundamentally hostile to the possibility of people forming unions in the first place right now? Because there have been increasing labor movements and organizational actions in, Amazon, for example. But it seems like things are very much on the side of people at these companies who want to stop their workers from unionizing. So,
well, I think that at the outset, we have a labor law system that makes it very, very hard to organize from the beginning. The idea that you have to sort of work from firm to firm to firm to organize a given workplace through a very, very extended process where even when you get to the bargaining table, you might not succeed at the end of the day in getting a contract in a meaningful amount of time. Yeah. That process alone creates a lot of hurdles for organizers. I think the economy has also changed dramatically from the heyday of the labor movement decades and decades ago, where it's not these, maybe massive factory where people are working all together in the same place, same space, and so on. We have different levels of organization firms where things are being contracted out to different parties. You might not necessarily even know what the parent firm is that you're actually working for in a given case. That's been exacerbated by the rise of the gig economy, certainly. And it's all very, very complicated in ways that the labor law has not really been updated to reflect. And, you get to then, after that, the active efforts that are made to frustrate organizing, right-to-work laws, that kind of thing. So there are a lot of hurdles there. But I think that we're at a moment where it's sort of also incumbent upon the labor movement to think critically about the extent to which their existing modes of organizing and the policies that they're advocating for might not reflect the realities of the current economy. Yeah. I think it's a time to think critically about new labor structures, new forms of organization. That might make a little bit more sense, which is not to say that traditional unions aren't important, that shouldn't grow. I think they should support the PRO Act. But, we live in a rapidly changing economy, a more complex economy than these laws were written for and these modes of organizing were developed for. And that matters. So I talk about the work of people like Sharon Block at Harvard on this question, where she and others are thinking really, really ambitiously about what different forms of organization might look like. I offer some of those ideas at the end of the book. But it's a difficult world to be doing organizing work in. But I think that we have models and ideas that are worth drawing from and worth exploring.
Yeah, let me dig into that a little bit further, because I think that that's a common – so this is where, again, and we could talk more about this, but the sort of tensions between liberalism and democracy come into play is that – and again, I don't want to I also think liberalism is a very capacious school of thought and tradition. And so, I think there are liberals who would have no problem whatsoever with unions, with more democratic structures within firms being incentivized or at least embraced, if not part of, institutional theory. But, let's take this other kind of view, which is that, a dynamic economy is the way to deal with potential problematic or undesirable forms of governance within firms. Because what yes, it might be without a union, without kind of these kind of stickier and more restrictive contracting, like obligations around contracts, then it might be easier for a worker to be fired. But ideally, that means that it'll be easier to get hired by a different firm. So there might be this emphasis on exit as opposed to voice. And so then the concern would be if we embrace or try to make it easier for people to collectively organize, then it makes it harder. We kind of make, by strengthening labor rights, you make the economy maybe less dynamic and less able to have that kind of, it's a little weird, but there's sort of an interoperability aspect to that, right?
Yeah, I think that there are real trade-offs. At the same time, though, I do wonder, even if we believe in exit as a mode of recourse for bad working conditions, how adequately have we protected the worker's right to exit? We have a economy where non-competes, for instance, really, really restrict your ability to just sort of leave your job and find a better one.
Yeah.
That's something that labor organizing and the advocacy of progressives is trying to fix. So, I think that there's like an idealized world where, everybody's kind of frictionless. You don't like this job, move to another one. That's not actually the world we live in. Even if without non-competes, even if we fix that situation, it's very, very hard to sort of like get up and find a different job. Americans are less mobile than ever in many respects. So those are problems that I think should incline us to say, well, yeah, you should have the right to exit, but what are the tools and resources we have within your workplace to improve conditions? And to your point, how do we balance the desirability of that with the desirability of economic dynamism and economic growth? I take growth very, very seriously. I'm not somebody, one of the people on the left who sort of dismisses the reality that growth lifts people up from their worst economic circumstances into better ones. We have to have an economy that grows, that is dynamic, where people can start new businesses and so on. But also, we're very, very, very skewed against the worker here in this country in ways that I do think have a deleterious impact on their well-being. And I don't think that, we have to believe that strengthening workers and improving that situation means that we give up economic growth and give up innovation and give up a dynamic economy. We have to strike a balance here. And I think that there's just a lot of interest in not trying to work out a balance. And I think that's a real problem. So, the book offers some ideas. It offers some trade-offs maybe for some of these policies. But I think there's a lot here that's worth considering and worth taking up. We don't have to sort of import the German labor model directly into the United States and believe it's going to work out in the same way. But, I think there's room here to experiment and work out what better labor arrangements might be.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're exactly right that's the thing is I think, growth is so important. And then there's this way in which if you're talking to somebody who just lost their job or somebody who has faced a hostile work environment and you still say, well, we don't want to mess with the way that our, labor relations work because we're going to lose our ability to grow. I mean, that doesn't mean anything when you're living in that kind of experience. And that is why, when we talk about political theory, when we talk about political economy and these different traditions, and we think about domination matters. I mean, we can't just avoid talking about that. And when somebody, you have to wonder, what happens if you feel as though you're powerless in those private spaces? What hope do you have that you think you can make a difference in the public spaces?
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's just like, who is growth for ultimately? And how broadly is growth distributed? It's not just about the growth happening as a matter of aggregate statistics. It's like, who is actually the beneficiaries? How much of that is actually going to the workers at these firms relative to investors, executives, and so on? And I think that those are questions that are worth asking, especially now. I mean, people are dissatisfied with the state of the economy in kind of unprecedented levels.
Yeah.
That's discontent that has to be wrestled with seriously. And I think if people who believe in a kind of dynamic economy sort of don't pay attention to that and sort of like sideline these kinds of conversations, I think the people who end up appealing to that discontent are people going to offer much worse economic solutions and kind of panaceas that don't actually work and actually make things worse. We see, I think, immigration policy playing some of that role here. So the discontent here matters. I do think there are cues we can take from places where labor laws are stronger. And I think the serious question is, how can we integrate all of that within the need? Again, I believe in to have a dynamic and growing economy. Yeah. The book offers a few provocations in that direction, but I just hope it sparks and opens a conversation here.
Well, and let's also get into more of the details here about the way that, because I do think I'm struck by the fact that you are taking seriously, because there are people who maybe romanticize the 20th century and who think there's maybe some way that we can go back to the economy of the 20th century or to also the landscape of unions in their heyday, when we are, the sort of dynamics towards a gig economy are so much harder to control or prevent, right? And so what then does it look like to update our understandings of how to help the American worker, how to think of labor and the possibility of Americans being able to collectively organize in the private sphere, while partly because of appreciation of growth, but partly just knowing the reality of our economy is that it has shifted in terms of the way people even like to work. I mean, there are people who are appreciative, who really benefit from the kinds of gig economy relations and labor experiences that provided by apps, provided by Uber and other apps, who want that flexibility that you wouldn't have had in the 20th century.
Yeah, I think that's real. So first of all, I think that this is actually one of the places where the political inequities I'm talking about and economic policy really, really intersect. The idea of going back to the 20th century. Very reductively, I think that we have a trade policy in this country right now that is built around the hope of returning the state of Michigan and other Rust Belt states, which you need to win the Electoral College, back to the magic of the 20th century, right? Yeah. So it's this idea, well, we now have a globalized economy where many things are being made overseas that are contributing to our economy. Obviously, there have been people in this country who've lost out. Yeah. And so, the kind of sloppy list solution to that is, well, we're just going to restrict trade, and then all those factories just kind of going to pop up out of the ground in the Rust Belt states again. And, it's manufacturing in particular that made those jobs good. There's something intrinsically good about working to build a car or working, in a sheet metal factory. That's better than other kinds of jobs. We need to bring those jobs specifically back. I think that's like very unserious.
It's very naive.
It's very naive. To me, and this is the analysis you would expect from someone on the left, but like to me, the thing that made those jobs stable and remunerative for many workers at the time was the fact that there were organized jobs. There were unions that were very, very strong in these places, in those industries. We have, in the south of this country, an auto industry that does not look at all like the 20th century auto industry in the Rust Belt. I think part of the difference there is it's not a unionized sector in the same kind of way. And to me, there's no reason to believe that the only kinds of jobs that are good or the best kinds of jobs that are good are going to be those kinds of manufacturing jobs in general, which is not to say we shouldn't have manufacturing jobs, that those jobs aren't important and so on. But like, I think that working at Walmart should be a good job that puts you on the pathway to making more money and that builds your wealth. I think that working in the service industry and other kinds of healthcare, education, like these should all be good jobs. And we should be thinking about the ways in which we are not doing enough to ensure those jobs are remunerative as they could be. And I think that labor is part of the answer and the solution there. I forgot what the second thing you said was.
Well, it was about also, people, when we talk about the gig economy, I think especially on the left, a lot of critiques. I'm very sympathetic to them, certainly. But at the same time, you talk to people who do make money through Uber, through these other, especially people who are doing more care work too, like, taking care of children and things like that. I mean, that they want the flexibility that those jobs give them, and maybe are less concerned from like the left critique of the way that these workers are exploited.
Yeah. I mean, I think, even if you have that critique, the existing models for labor organization are not going to work with an Uber or with a DoorDash. It's just reality. And so there have been people who are thinking very creatively over the last decade or so about different forms of organization. Let's bring groups of rideshare drivers together, for instance, in kind of cooperatives so that they can negotiate with Uber on that basis or like appeal to Uber on that basis, advocate for their own rights. So it's not just you and this opaque company mediated you're interacting with through an app, but like you as a collective of workers coming together. And it's not even just the gig economy where you see those kinds of dynamics in place. So I did a piece in the last couple of years about the direct care industry in Colorado. So people who go into people's homes who are elderly or disabled, and they work on a very, very intimate one-to-one basis with those people. Might work for a company or a firm, but not interact actually with anybody else in that company. You can't organize that in the way that you organize a traditional union. And so there's this body, this one's set up in Colorado, called the Direct Care Stabilization Board, where they bring together worker representatives from the state, representatives from the companies themselves, to come together and talk about working conditions, maybe propose some basic standards. And it's part of, this wave of wage and workers' boards we've seen over the last 10, 15 years. It's seen as a kind of step towards sectoral bargaining.
Yes.
There are stronger versions of this and weaker versions of this, especially, California, they have a fast food board, for instance, that has the ability to just set wages. But, those kinds of things I think have to be explored for a lot of reasons, but partially because it is much, much easier to fit that kind of model for labor into the current economy than the traditional firm-to-firm, place-to-place model. And if you had those kinds of institutions, I think you would preserve a lot of the dynamism, the freedom that people see in being able to work for themselves through an app and use that as part of their supplemental income. But again, I think that the presumption that, once upon a time we had good jobs and they were in these four industries and we just have to bring those jobs in those industries back through magic or insane trade policy or insane immigration policy, it's not going to work. And it's incumbent upon people, from whatever ideological perspective you have, to think more, deeply about what actual empowerment would look like.
Yeah. Well, and when you were talking about the idea of like factories popping up from the ground, I mean, it made me laugh, but it's also like I don't laugh because I make light or because I don't respect the people who miss those jobs and who want those jobs. But I have to be honest. I mean, being around members of the elite who make this rhetoric around and try to appeal and try to create this kind of romantic ideal of, mid-century America, and then also this sort of maybe, masculine worker who works with his hands. And it's just so tired and strange and just, like I said, naive and it's almost infantilizing to think that people are going to be convinced that this is what the future of our economy is going to be able to look like. And instead, and it's, I think, demeaning to the people who are now making up so much of the actual American worker today. Yeah. People in care work, especially women in care work, right? There is a certain kind of gendered nature to the way that this discourse
Absolutely.
happens.
I mean, I think that, politically, it's don't really know very much about a lot of things. But, the composition of the economy is, I think, one of the areas where you see this disconnect between the rhetoric and reality in ways that end up mattering for economic policy. So, for instance, whenever people talk about rural America, and campaigns, and you do these aerial shots of like fields of corn and so on, it's like everybody in rural America is a corn farmer. Whether you look at actual statistics, it's not that different from job composition terms from the other parts of the country. Like the big industries are service, education, healthcare, government. Like these are increasingly, no matter where you live, the basic features of the economy. And if you actually spend time in rural America, like you go out to rural Kentucky, you end up at a Walmart and you realize like that Walmart is employing like dozens of people and it's like the economic center for maybe a couple of miles around, and it's and this is one of the things that I think understanding this might also make our politics a little bit more insane, right? So the idea that we're not living these kind of like vastly different, unintelligible lives, but actually like are, many of us are all just working for Walmart. Could help us build a kind of common economic agenda rather than, depending on these presuppositions that there are these radically different agendas that different parts of the country need or radically different kinds of political representation that other parts of the country need. Yes. Many of us, as different as we might be in certain respects, have the same bosses and are being shaped by the same forces. And I think that matters. And I think that we'd have a better politics and better policies if politicians realize this.
Well, and I think that, to your point, and also to bring it back to democracy, this is why I think on the one, and you talk about this in the book, but there's a lot of cheap talk around democracy, a lot of kind of like flowery language about democracy. And then, but the reason why democracy really matters is because political elites all the time are going to conjure images of who the ordinary citizen is, who the person is that they supposedly speak to. But they will, unless there's like actual democratic institutions that actually have any kind of power that is really responsive to the people themselves. And even in that case, so often those images that are evoked are really going to be the things that they benefit from or the world that they want to see or the particular group that they're actually speaking to and not the ordinary citizen. And so that is also a form of cheap talk, and then at the same time kind of make this flowery language towards democracy.
You realize that the image in your head is not the public, but you also realize through democracy that the public itself is very, very dynamic, is capable of change. Yeah. So one of the things I point out in the early chapters of this book is, I'm not offering a model of democracy where there is this mass called the people or the majority that is a stable entity that you just appeal to and refer to every time you have an election. What democracy is like a stable set of processes through which, through fair competition and through the assembly majorities, the public makes itself heard, but you might have a different majority or a different governing coalition in the next election or in the next couple of years. And there's this dynamism to it. Because I think that there are people who appeal to democracy in contrast by reference to a people or a majority that is also kind of imagined in the very same way, And it's the public is very complicated. And one of the things we want democracy to do actually is to give the public the opportunity to say, well, we had an election and this group of people won as the majority. Their policies either did or did not work. And we might have reason to try a new set of policies or a new set of candidates next time around. That kind of dynamism and that change is part of the reason why I think democracy is desirable. So I think that politicians, they construct in their heads the images of the public that they want. And I think that they are enabled in this any time that the structures of our institutions empower some people at the expense of others. If some people end up winning much or most of the time, it's easier for politicians to say, well, that is the actual public they're responding to. And it's, it's ex-urban or rural people who live in these parts of the country and people who live in Washington, D.C., or people who live in New York or Los Angeles or Baltimore or whatever, don't really matter. Like the actual public is this majority that ends up shaping elections every couple of years. Yeah, that distorts policymaking. It leads to incorrect conclusions about the public and its desires. And I think it makes us a less dynamic society than we could be.
And I think there is a way in which, like, this is always – and I will also just kind of bring it back to maybe some reflection on how you see your work as a journalist, as a scholar, as an author, and talking about somebody who is also influencing the way that people think about American politics. And so, politicians do this, but also pundits do this. I do this. Scholars do this. So, kind of, how do you think about like the responsibility of having a platform and of trying to make sense of this environment and knowing that what you say matters?
Well, I'm not sure it does. I kind of hope it does. That's a good point.
I mean, I will say, actually, it is very good to not be, so egotistical that you think what you say will necessarily matter.
Well, I mean, especially now, given that like all of us who write are competing with like Call of Duty streamers for the attention of the voting public. I mean, I really don't. I don't know how much work like this actually shifts things. I think that the model for me for most of the time I've been doing this is, like most people are not going to pick up this book or are going to be aware that it exists, but maybe people who are like in the policy space or in politics, working in campaigns, working in advocacy groups, they read this and they shift their thinking about how they message or how they approach a policy issue. And, to the extent that I understand that people have been doing that. I've heard a lot from democracy groups and other nonprofits in that space. I mean, they are in the moment right now where I think they're trying to figure out, given the failure to move on a lot of these issues under the Biden administration, they had the For the People Act and so on, they're trying to regroup and think about what's next. There's been this discourse in the last year and a half or so after the 2024 election about whether it was wrong to focus on democracy and whether Democrats should continue even using the word democracy in their appeals. Yeah. I think that the book is an intervention in that debate too, because it says from the outset, literally from the first chapter, we talk about democracy in a very blinkered and unappealing and kind of sterile way. People don't believe that there is a democracy in America to save in the first place. And to sort of run as though there was a mistake. People also want from democracy or from their institutions in general real material benefits. And if you're talking about democracy in a way that's abstracted from all of that, they're going to lose, at least on that issue. So, I think that the book has been, or at least I hope it's been, a useful intervention on those fronts. As far as influencing discourse in general, my responsibility, I don't know. I try to be, I'm a very slow writer, and I think that has been to my detriment in certain respects. But also it is how I think you come to conclusions that are actually worthwhile and novel. There's a version of this book that was much easier, where I did not read, the latest in the literature about redistricting, and I also did not read The Republic Again by Plato, and just sort of did the standard democracy is broken, whatever. And it just would have been a lesser work. And there's all kinds of books like that already. But the fact here and in my other work that I do take the time to know what I'm talking about and not just fire off takes and consult academic literature and consult political theory and so on. I mean, that I feel is all me trying to meet my responsibility to put new information into the world, or new arguments at the very least into the world, and to try to shape how people see an issue with more than just conventional wisdom and more than my own presuppositions. And that's, I think, the attitude that, whatever kind of writing you do, whatever kind of journalism you do, you ought to have. Because then what's the point? I'm, again, skeptical about whether there is a point even doing work at this level. But I think if it's worth doing at all, it's worth doing in this way.
Well, I think, you brought up Plato, so that, there is this interesting thing with the Republic where, there's these different ways to read it. And I think one way is even to read it as like almost an anti-political work, in the sense of like the philosopher might read it and see and think like, well, the real kind of way to live your life is to kind of like abstain from politics, right? But then it's like, why would the philosopher engage in politics? And it would be to not be ruled by those worst. And so there is this thing with writing and with, engaging in public discourse, especially, if you're somebody who has, a certain expertise or, being recognized as a figure in some capacity or having a platform in some capacity, where the thing that I worry about is that there's such a demand, for content, for fast hot takes, for writing fast. And what happens with that is and actually this is also something that Plato talks about. We'll bracket that, but you get sort of immersed in opinion and then distracted from kind of higher quality, deeper research and reflection. And then if you do think that this is what I'm struggling with, is that I think there are people who don't have the humility you have, who you just stated the idea of you're not sure anything you do say has an impact. And I think it's very valuable to have that humility, and we need people like that who have that humility because they're more, I think, careful about what they say, they think with a lot of consideration in terms of how they express themselves. But then there are people who I think maybe don't have that humility, who are very confident, and then are being heard, are being listened to, and then potentially perpetuating certain kinds of scapegoating, of getting us away from the fundamental problems, inflaming things around immigration, around trans people, for example, and not realizing that to some degree what you are saying might lead public opinion in certain directions, especially, again, the more followers you have, the more people who are buying your books and listening to you. I mean, I do think there is a responsibility that comes with that field. And so then we need people who are willing to express themselves in careful and slow ways. And even if that means that, they have to, it's a certain kind of pressure to kind of be doing that. But I guess what I'm trying to say, maybe there's a way in which when you think that you aren't necessarily going to have an impact, maybe that's something that helps you kind of be willing to kind of take the time and then therefore say something that you're proud of because of the integrity that you have.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I just, I do this because I would like to have an impact. Yeah. So there's also an absence of humility there, where part of the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to change the things in the world around me that I think are wrong. But I think being detached from the kinds of vicissitudes of day in, day out discourse is very important for all of those reasons you described. Just, I think maybe it is to the benefit of writers in general that they're no longer competing for all of these views and retweets or whatever, because more and more of the discursive field is shifting over to other mediums. And so writers, if you're going to do this, have to be doing it for other reasons beyond that kind of gratification. So yeah, I'm not really sure. But also, because I'm doing this because I want to have an impact, I've been thinking about, video and other mediums where I could be expressing these ideas. I've certainly appeared in a hell of a lot of podcasts for this book. So
thank you.
That's part of it. But yeah, no, I think we're in a moment, though, where it's just, I wrote something for the Columbia Journalism Review a few years ago. I think the title was what is the point of political writing? Both because, it's often unclear how much you're influencing the public, but also, to bring it back full circle to democracy, a country where it does not actually necessarily matter what majorities believe or think or want anyway. So even if you were successful in persuading the majority of the public to agree with you, it might not necessarily do anything in the world. In that case, then what is the point of any of this? And I still don't have an answer. So I think one of the, self-interested reasons why I want us to be a democracy is because then it makes writing matter a little bit more. Because then if people agree with me, that actually it does something. So I don't know. It's all very complicated. I think this is a very unsettled and challenging time to be a writer in many respects. But I also think it's perversely a very, very interesting time. And a time where ideas matter, and a time where, a lot of the gatekeepers and a lot of the norms and presuppositions have kind of been eroded to the point where we have this free-for-all, and we can return to things like the Constitution with new eyes and without the kind of reverence that we've inherited. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of intellectually promising work that can come from an environment like that. Yeah. But I think it's also very dangerous. Yeah. And so it's up to each of us as writers to know what we're about and know what our principles are, and hopefully approach these questions with a humane public-mindedness. And that's what I try to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, not to, throw, it's not like we won't have time to fully flesh this out, but to some degree that's on purpose. But, one of the reasons why I asked that question is because I've been thinking a lot about why I write. Why does somebody write? Because AI has kind of introduced this. I mean, you could say AI slap. You have all this, but let's just say in the very least, way more competition in terms of stuff that people could read online. And so for me, it's like when I write, I am writing always to some degree for myself. I mean, that sounds selfish, and maybe to some degree it is. I do think like AI is interesting because it's like writing that's almost entirely for the consumer, like to some degree, like the consumer creates it. So if you're using a chatbot, you use a chatbot to create writing for yourself for you to read. Or there's also this way in which like people are oriented around like, well, I'm using AI because like it helps me, get more stuff out there, like more ideas that I wouldn't have time to kind of write, and or maybe it helps me flesh out ideas. Like that's a little bit of a separate thing. But I think the more people rely on it for content generation, it's like I'm looking for an audience that I'm like trying to send this out to, and it's like I write because I'm trying to figure out what I think in the first place, right? Exactly. And so like I hope that it might be indirectly helpful if I end up publishing it for other people, and I would like it to potentially influence how other people think. But it's also like I actually will also say I'm eager for other people to talk back at me in a respectful way, to be clear. But I want a conversation. It's like, so the part of the process is selfish and individual, and that I'm writing for myself as my own audience and trying to figuring out what I think in the first place. But then after it has become a product, I guess, it still isn't something that, I just want to send out there and hope that everybody else is eating it up and loving it. It's like I hope that I've become part of something bigger than myself, and I am something I will learn through that process from others.
No, I think that's exactly right, and it matches the way I think as well. I mean, I don't use AI for anything, and there are a dozen different reasons why we can get into it, but we'd here for 5 more hours. But I don't use it for anything, and when it comes to thinking through writing specifically, everything that's in this book is in there because, to your point, like I consulted information and I consulted data and consulted political theory, and I came to the conclusions I make having thought through all of that. Yeah. And so I trust it in that way. Yeah. If something appears before me on a screen and I don't know where it came from, I have no reason to trust it in the same kind of way. Yeah. Even if it's the rendering of somebody else's ideas, it matters to me that I read, William Ricker, and I sort of worked through that. Rather than sort of trusting a summary that was produced by wherever, And that's the point for me. Like I want to trust the things that I'm saying, but also I want to engage in the process of thinking myself and reasoning myself and not outsourcing that to kind of something opaque that I don't really know, understand, that is trying to make money from me. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of my orientation. But, the thing about this moment that is, again, both really, really intellectually interesting and really, really scary is that those premises are not universally shared. Yes. And you have to actually make a case for them. Yeah. You cannot presume as a writer or as an artist or as a filmmaker or musician or whatever happens to be that everybody is doing those things from the same premises that you are. Yes. People do. It's been revealed very, very starkly in the last year, 2 years. Have very different ideas about what creativity means and what it means to think and what it means to write and why somebody should do any of these things. And if we have our own perspectives on all of that, we actually now are in a position where we have to make an argument to people that they should agree. And I think we can. But yeah, it won't do to just sort of, hold on to a world where, we all assumed that we all were on the same page on what art was. Yeah. And again, that's exciting because, it would be great to write the definitive set of arguments that actually tell us what art is all about and what it's for and so on. But it's also, if we don't do that, then the people who end up making decisions are, very, very strange people in Silicon Valley. Yeah. So, that's the promise and the peril of the moment here. Yeah.
Very, very well said. I really have been very grateful. This entire conversation has been excellent. I really enjoyed it. I do want to give you an opportunity. Is there anything that we talked about, anything that we didn't talk about that you would like to chat more on?
It covered a lot of ground. I don't think so. I think we just about covered everything.
Well, let me ask then also, what are you working on right now? What's next?
So yeah, I have some reviews that I'm doing between now and the end of the year. I have a book on literacy I'm reviewing, or the literacy crisis, if there is one, for the New Republic. I'm reviewing a book on the college-educated working class and kind of economic discontent amongst sort of like educated people and its impacts. I am going to write something about AI between now and the end of the year. That's going to be like a Jeremiah of some kind. I just need the time to do it. So yeah, like little things like that. But also, I'm thinking about the next book project. I have an idea of what it is. It is going to be about the American idea and American nationalism and sort of thinking about it from the left and whether there's a recoverable vision and purpose for this society that we should be talking up in this moment now. So yeah, that's kind of what I've had on the docket, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
There's an election this year.
Right. I'm sure you'll be writing something about that.
That's right. So yeah, that's what I've got so far.
Well, great. A lot to look forward to then. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
As usual, there's a few reflections that I want to share before we wrap things up. Osita intervenes in debates today about whether public discourse, especially among politicians and pundits, anybody trying to influence politics, should appeal to American democracy. Osita argues that people too often talk about democracy in the abstract, separate from any kind of material benefits or the everyday difficulties that Americans deal with in their daily lives. He argues that America is actually not a democracy, but it should be. Osita defines democracy using three metrics: political equality, that is to say, no person or class of people has an entrenched political privilege or distinct set of rights; responsiveness, that is to say, eventually and on some measures, the legislation and government action often reflects Americans' preferences or interests; and majoritarian rule. But his vision of democracy includes freedoms and rights, constraints that are typically referred to as liberal, such as freedoms of speech, freedoms of association, and is a dynamic vision of democracy. That is to say, that the composition of majority coalitions are always shifting, and whoever wins or loses elections is always changing. While even the title of Osita's book calls for a new American founding, he is clear that he's not calling for some sort of immediate national convention to amend the Constitution as outlined in Article 5. Instead, he emphasizes that changes need to be developed through long-term mobilization with the general public's genuine participation and buy-in. That said, he argues that some of the dysfunction of American politics, such as their institutions' lack of responsiveness to voters' preferences or lack of opportunities for self-governance, can be mitigated at the state level and in civil society organizations. And participating in organizations and smaller institutions exercising collective action can help Americans exercise agency and practice the civic habits that efforts at more constitutional level changes would require in the first place. Osita's book also addresses what he calls economic democracy. He argues people in power can't just dismiss the economic discontent and frustration of Americans, even as we acknowledge that policy responses that emphasize tariffs won't work to bring back the good jobs that they promise. He argues for people on both sides of the political spectrum to cease making these false promises about a return to a mid-century manufacturing economy that will not come back, and to come to terms with the many changes that our economy is defined by, from automation to the gig economy and other distinctive features of our time. Osita criticized how much the law makes it difficult for workers to unionize or otherwise act in concert, and his work shows how sectoral organizations can help workers find resources and fight for improvements in their workplaces. Here, I think I have to note that many economists criticize unions as economically inefficient. While they initially increase wages for the original unionized workers, these gains dissipate. In terms of a classic text, though there's more recent research, you could see Gordon Tullock's 1975 transitional gains trap. However, many economists will also acknowledge that those who support unions and other organizational structures to enhance worker power often do so for reasons that are beyond wages or economic efficiency, such as the ability to exercise voice to shape the direction of a firm and to remedy oppressive workplace conditions. In his book, Osita discusses the massive surveillance and widespread injuries suffered by workers in Amazon warehouses and drivers, as well as the company's efforts to thwart unionization, to give one such example. But if you're skeptical of unions, economists also argue for other policy solutions that can help workers more than tariffs ever will. My colleague Leah Palakashvili works on portable benefits for independent contractors, from truckers to care workers, which are designed to help gig workers and other independent workers access employment benefits such as healthcare and retirement funds. Despite their differences, I like that Osita's and Leah's approaches start from a clear-eyed view of many kinds of real people who fall under the commonly evoked image of the American worker and the need for policy solutions to avoid naive nostalgia for a past that we will never get back. Given this year's anniversary of The Wealth of Nations, I couldn't help but think of Adam Smith's critiques of tariffs and subsidies, which usually helped some merchants and industries at the expense of many of the poorest workers and the population as a whole. I discussed these arguments in earlier episodes this season with Smith scholars Maria P. Paganelli and Glory Liu, so if you're interested in more, check those out. I'll add that this conversation with Osita reminded me of some of my other favorite passages from Wealth of Nations, where Smith criticizes how laws made it easy for merchants to meet and coordinate together while prohibiting their employees, poor workers, from doing the same. To be clear, this is a very different historical context. Smith was not talking about unions. But as long as we continue to turn to Smith as a resource for political economy, it's important to keep in mind that he himself considered not only how laws and policies shaped wages or economic efficiency, but the power that employers and industry leaders can wield in the political system and in the private sphere over their own employees and the market as a whole. I'm so grateful to Osita for joining me and to you for listening. Till next time.